Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here and pleased to see so many of my students in attendance. This is a very fancy title for a 10-minute presentation in the history of, it's called, it's a brief history of attitudes towards work leading to Phelpsian modernism. So I should be careful to talk about ideas of this scope in such a learned audience. However, it's a subject I've wanted to explore and present to this group for a very long time, and there's no time like the present. So let's begin at the beginning with Aristotle, who, as we know, observed that humans are unique and engaged in rational thought. That was our specific purpose. It distinguished us from the animals. And he said citizens must not lead the life of mechanics and tradesmen, because such a life is ignoble and inimical to virtue. It was the life of the animal, dealing with base needs. The second stream in the ancient anti-work movement was from Christianity. In paradise, you didn't work. As punishment for original sin, you had to work. And I believe that that is not a feature of the Judaism or Jewish theology, which would see work as an opportunity to fulfill God's purpose in the world. It's unique to the Christian tradition. Now, that was carried forward into Western civilization, not because people read Aristotle's Politics or studied the book of Genesis, but through the vehicles of the church and of the aristocracy that looked down on work. And then fast forward to the influence of Kantian Freedom. Anything that you do because you're responding to an outside force, it means that you are, to that extent, not free. And maybe that anti-work hit rock bottom with Rousseau in arguing that any engagement in commerce was a corruption of our natural innocence. Okay, now it's time to turn to Adam Smith. I think it was a partial turning point when Smith observed that no, it's not, work is not something we do that we have in common with the animals, but in fact, we differ from the animals. He famously said the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another is common to men, and not to be found in any other race of animals. Nobody ever saw a dog make a fair and deliberate exchange of one bone for another with another dog. So it's part of our nature, but it was non-judgmental. It was just something that we did. And as economists, we carry forward the neoclassical view, many of us do, who are not under the influence of Ned and his ideas that consumers maximize household production. They work in order to gain resources that they combine with leisure and consumption, and therefore increase their welfare. Now the turning point was the early Marx. And I've been reading this Marx and Engels over the summer, and there are moments where I feel like it comes right out of Mass Flourishing. Marx pointed out, unlike the animals that only work in response to some immediate and physical need, humans consciously engage in production. And as he said, Smith had no inkling, and this is the Grundrisse, whatever, that overcoming of obstacles is itself a liberating activity, and hence is self-realization, hence real freedom, whose action precisely is labor, freely chosen. So, you see, man is different from the animals, then, because he produces consciously, willfully, exercising his muscles, his power, his ingenuity. But in its historic form, as Marx diagnosed the problem, labor in the 19th century, labor on the production line, did not deliver the good life, as we would call it. That he identified 4 forms of alienation. Alienation comes when a creation, as Marx understood it, as I understand Marx, when the creation of a subject would create an object that would in turn dominate the subject and estrange them. So as the worker's product is appropriated by the capitalist and it's only valued for its abstract money that it brings, it's valued in exchange, it becomes commodified, and then the worker is distanced from his product. His motions are dictated by the capitalist. This is again in Marx's critique of one would have to think of a factory, that dictated by the capitalist and is alienated from himself, or from his work. And then as a person's consciousness and his meaning is derived from his labor, he becomes alienated from himself. And as his work as a social activity becomes alienated from other people. Now, Smith actually had one time where he commented on this. This is pretty extraordinary. He said, in the progress of division of labor, production line, he said, the man who spent his whole life in performing a few simple operations will this will naturally corrupt the courage of his mind. Now, this is not necessarily a problem for the worker in Smith's analysis, but it means that he will be unfit, say, to serve in the military, to do anything other than these few simple tasks. And he actually did say, I don't remember the exact words, but he said the government should take pains to prevent this from happening. But it was just one remark in the Wealth of Nations. And, the solution was certainly not for the workers to own the means of production. That was not what Smith had in mind. It would be fixed by changing the nature of work. Now, in the Phelpsian Critique, the role of an economy is more than delivering goods and services in abundance. It offers a playing field for workers and entrepreneurs for all ability and levels to flourish and realize in a social context. Now, no economy has delivered these satisfactions for everyone. I happen to know what Ned's going to say in this talk. I just think there's one really remarkable idea that I'd never heard before. I'd never heard it before from Ned. Even if we were able to create an economy where we ended discrimination and all different types of groups had relatively equal outcomes, there was equality broadly speaking in the economy, and there was abundance. And rewarding work broadly for workers where they could derive meaning in the workplace. There's still one group that would be left out, those who are less able. And whatever their demographic situation might be. And the less able have an equal claim on a right to a job where they can flourish. Sorry, Ned, this is too good to keep it in. Part of Ned's contribution is to analyze what are the conditions that lead to a dynamic economy that creates these opportunities for meaningful and rewarding work. And there's also plenty of evidence that this also leads to innovation and greater abundance, but that's really besides the point. Even if it didn't, it would still be desirable for its own sake. So the point that I want to make is the Phelpsian critique ought to occupy its place if we get right to the early Marx and then recognize that we can that we can provide work that will be valued in and of itself, but it doesn't require the Marxian solution of workers overthrowing the capitalists. That there's another way to do it, and that it can be done through the propagation of modern values and all of the other policy recommendations that we discuss here. You know, I think some of the evidence is not bad right now. Here's the use of the term inclusive work environment. So some of this is catching on. I think people understand now that work ought to be more than just sacrifice of leisure in exchange for wages. But neither is the evidence all good. There's a modern anti-work movement which is blossoming. And, you know, I think it's a dead end. In contrast to the hopeful vision of Phelpsian dynamism, it instills values that will serve its adherents poorly. And it doesn't even hold out the promise of a communist revolution that everyone knows by now is not going to work. So instead it just degenerates into kind of nihilism. So, returning to a hopeful stance, I'd like to introduce Grace Nguyen. Grace is completing her PhD in sociology at the University of Wisconsin. Her fascinating dissertation covers a lot of ground, but one aspect that's relevant to us is an up-to-date, on-the-spot characterization of how service businesses today can provide a rewarding work in which workers can flourish and find meaning on the job.
Hi everybody. I am very happy to be here to share with you all my work on the construction of the regular in a service setting. This will be a microanalysis of social interaction in the workplace. So first, I'd like to outline what I'm going to discuss in the next 15 minutes. First, I'll share with you how I became interested in the regular. Then I'll briefly describe my methods. And next, I'll outline the process of the co-construction of the regular. And then I'm going to focus on one of these processes in more depth. So I currently live in New York City, where I spent 6 years working in a fine dining restaurant. And in this restaurant in the study is what I refer to as downtown. I started as a host when I was first hired and became maitre d' 3 years later. A large part of the job as maitre d' is managing guest relations, which is everything having to do with how we interact with guests over the phone, via email, and face-to-face. When I started to work at the restaurant, I began to learn who the important guests were. Most restaurants call them VIPs. Another name for them is PX, or person extraordinaire. They can be chefs or others who work in the food and beverage industry, friends and family of the chef, actors, politicians, and regulars of the restaurant. And every restaurant has their VIPs. So I became interested in one particular group of VIPs, the regulars, because I noticed how much energy the staff devoted to them every time they returned to the restaurant. They're economically important because they're a consistent revenue for the restaurant. Through word of mouth, they are great ambassadors of the restaurant's philosophy, bringing in their friends to dine with them. And regulars even increase the morale of the staff when they come in because the staff loves seeing regulars return. So I started to think about regulars and how one became a regular. And that became the central question of this study. What is a regular and how is one constructed? So I theoretically ground my argument in symbolic interaction theory, and which I'll discuss a little bit later. And I argue that a regular is not a fixed, predetermined category of patrons, nor is it a label given to oneself based on number of visits. Rather, a regular is a status that confers special benefits, privileges, or recognition, and one that is enjoyed by repeat customers and jointly constructed out of a series of interactions between different actors within a service setting. There are a few social science studies that examine regulars as central actors within the establishment. And those that do explore regulars view them as a category of individuals that help scholars understand other sociological phenomenon. For instance, examining structural inequality in the workplace, as in Rachel Sherman's work on luxury hotels, or understanding masculinity and desire, as in Kate Frank's study of strip clubs. In the marketing literature, regulars are categorized as repeat customers, who are distinct from first-time customers. These studies identify attributes such as emotions, trust, or commitment as independent variables and study their effects on customer loyalty and future customer behavior. And within this literature, regulars are generally understood to mean a group of patrons who frequent a business regularly. They are a definitive, predetermined category of individuals. This literature has not examined processes that lead to how regulars are constructed in the first place. And my study attempts to do just this. So I took field notes over the 6 years I spent as a participant observer at the restaurant. I conducted semi-structured interviews with two groups of people, those who worked in the hospitality industry and then those who frequented the restaurant regularly, or the regulars. In total, I interviewed 17 employees and 17 diners. So I outline a process where workers and diners co-construct the status of regulars, and I'll briefly go over it here. The first is making the connection. Second, recognizing and acknowledging guests when they return. The third is learning and maintaining expectations. Fourth, gift giving as a way for regulars to foster relationships with the staff. And then the fifth is a process of how regulars handle mistakes made by the staff, which I call mistakes in tact. So today I'm going to focus on one process, the process of learning and maintaining expectations, mostly because it's foundational to my main argument of how regulars are co-constructed. So as guests return to the restaurant, staff begins to learn their preferences, their allergies, what cocktails they enjoy, what wines they like to drink, whether they drink sparkling or still or tap water, even which tables they prefer. And they even learn how regulars like to interact with them. So despite being a fine dining restaurants, the regulars at downtown prefer to interact with the staff in a casual manner. In my interviews, regulars contrasted downtown to other restaurants where they were treated more formally. They say this felt scripted. One regular commented on how this formal style of service made the workers feel like servants, and this made them uncomfortable. So in these moments of feeling discomfort, these regulars would attempt to change the interaction using devices such as humor to get the staff to relax or get them off script. Regulars didn't return to these restaurants where the service was more formal. And this is why they continued to return to downtown, because we made them feel comfortable. So when I interviewed the staff, I learned that they too preferred to interact with the guests in a more casual manner. One server tells me how she was aware between the divide. She's aware of the divide between the staff and the guests, but she distinguished class from status and power. Having more wealth didn't make one more important than someone else, nor did it give anybody license to treat others poorly. And this was the general sentiment of all the workers in the restaurant. Servers also held immense knowledge of the food and the wine that they would talk about with regulars. And regulars loved learning about what they were eating and drinking. So a server tells me, your dinner experience wouldn't exist without me. So how is either one of us more important in this scenario? So workers held egalitarian values and believed themselves to be equal to those they served. Workers and regulars mutually constructed sustained moments of equality by engaging in casual interactions. And it is under these conditions that individuals were able to connect and build meaningful relationships. So over the course of getting to know the regulars, I began to see them less as customers and more as family and friends of the restaurant. Many of them have become friends over the years, having gone out to dinner and drinks outside the restaurant. So grounded in symbolic interaction theory, I explore these processes through which the relationships are created and maintained. And I show how the regular comes into existence and is reproduced through interactive work. I look to Georg Simmel and his ideas about sociability to understand how individuals engage and make connections. Simmel argues that sociability is a playful form of interacting, and people engage out of pure enjoyment of the conversation and interaction with the other person. Without knowing anything of the other, servers and guests interact in a routinized manner in the context of their roles. Discussions are usually about the food, its ingredients and preparation, or the wine, the grapes, producers, and taste. And this sociability can only be maintained when individuals see each other as equals, a bubble of equality in which participants leave social status, education, and background aside. So as regulars and servers, as much as regulars and servers interact in ways that make everyone feel equal, it is workers who understand that things are far from equal. And I'll give you an example from my own data. There have been times when I approach a regular at their table to say hello, and they may offer me a glass of wine and ask me to have a drink with them. They'll even ask me to sit down. And in these moments, the staff knows that we cannot accept these offers because we are working and we are there to make them as guests feel comfortable. So there's a hierarchy embedded within these relationships that workers have with regulars. And it is through these egalitarian interactions, like acting casually with one another, that gives the appearance of bridging the social distance between workers and diners. And it is under these conditions that this bubble of equality, that workers and diners are able to build meaningful relationships. So the important part of the study is that making connections are more likely under conditions in which those involved in the interaction feel equal. Regulars and workers jointly construct these conditions through interactions, creating an environment that obscures class boundaries and allowing workers and guests to pretend that hierarchies don't exist when in fact they do. So this is only one of the processes by which workers and diners co-construct the status of a regular. I also want to add that these interactions are embedded in and driven by feelings of comfort and joy, enthusiasm, and a sense of belonging. Interacting in this way makes everyone feel good. Guests, particularly regulars, feel like they're a part of a community. And for workers, casual and friendly interactions make workers feel good about service work. Mostly, because at the end of the day, this is all work. I also draw on other interaction theorists to offer insights into the process of how regulars are co-constructed. So I mentioned Simmel and sociability. I looked to Randall Collins and his concept of emotional energy to understand how emotions help create feelings of solidarity among workers and diners. From Marcel Mauss, I incorporate his ideas about gift giving and how the act of offering a gift signifies a relationship between individuals. Then I draw on Irving Goffman and his work on interaction rituals to understand how participants use face-saving strategies, such as showing tact, to help sustain the interaction and thereby maintain the relationship. Lastly, I'd like to point out that co-constructing regulars isn't just a transactional relationship in a service setting. It is a process through which individuals from different social standings and class standings come together and create a new set of relationships that transcends individual differences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to expand the conversation in two directions. One is a theology of a Christian theological understanding of work, which is not necessarily derived from the Genesis passage. Christianity shares with Judaism a respect for work. God, of course, worked 6 days, and on the seventh day, God held a Sabbath. The medieval monastics talked about ora et labora. So we have to distinguish between a hamartiology, which is the original sin of work, and the actual valorization of work as we get in theories of vocation, where God gives people their individual ways in which they can express themselves in a reciprocal community. So that's my first point. And the second point is to address the notion of Geselligkeit, or sociability, which is a fascinating topic, particularly in the German intellectual tradition. It goes back to its roots in German Romanticism, and particularly Friedrich Schleiermacher at the turn of the 19th century theorized Geselligkeit as one cultural institution in which one would actually break down race, gender, and religious barriers in order to really participate in this playful discourse. So I loved your use of the Geselligkeit.
Thank you. Thank you.
I accept your. I had to pick my translation very carefully to rig it in my favor with the Wycliffe translation, because I know it's not really there in the original Hebrew. But I would still maintain my point that there has been a strain in Christianity in the church that does not elevate labor and work, that has filtered down to, well, we can argue about it. All right.
Thanks. Hi. John Haidt, NYU Stern, and I'm also a regular at Downtown. So a question for you, Grace. We've heard we've heard a scathing indictment of capitalism, well grounded in facts, and we hear lots of work on how dehumanizing labor is in America, especially as things get more efficient and wage pressures. And it sounds like, well, here, if the issue is really just like, are we equals, or are we just kind of like, it sounds like a great place to work. It sounds like relationships. It sounds so humane. So my question for you is, to what extent is the kind of situation you're describing, the kind of culture, unique to these relatively small, high-end places? Or do you think that this same sociability occurs in just your regular sort of mid-tier restaurant all over America?
I think that's a good question. Having gone out to eat in a number of different places of different caliber, I would say the process of just social interacting is similar. The rules that workers have to abide by vary per restaurant. I would say that people engage, even when you call customer service over the phone and you interact with somebody, I would say the way that the customer service agent is personable and warm. It follows many of the same processes. Like there's some empathy. There's they ask you how you're doing. So I think it happens. This process happens in many different locations. At our restaurant, it's unique in that the managers encourage us to be ourselves. There are other fine dining restaurants, for instance, I know that the workers are not allowed to give hugs to their guests. And I mean, you've been to the restaurant. It's all about hugs and welcomes and things like that. And that's why we have a culture that fits that regulars are attracted to. And other restaurants with the no hugging policy, they have their own regulars. It's just a different style of service. But at this restaurant, the workers are encouraged to be themselves. They hire a particular group of employees who have diverse experiences. This other restaurant, this no hugging policy restaurant, I actually applied there and I wasn't hired. And it was because I mentioned that I was doing a PhD, and the CEO said, we don't hire /servers, which meant a dancer/server, a student/server. They wanted somebody who was committed to the industry. And so they saw other activities or other professional interests as maybe a distraction. When I went to this restaurant, the managers looked at that as an asset because he recognized the diversity of our guests, and that we have academics who come in, we have people coming in who who come to see the ballet or the theater. So our staff has dancers and MFA students and PhD students, and this diversity with this diversity, we're able to talk with different guests about different things. And so it is the processes are the same, but then the background of the staff creates that particular culture. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that talk, Grace. I'm Margaret Levy, Stanford University, and it's a follow-up really to Jonathan's question. You're talking about the relationship between the customer or the client and the server, but there's a whole other set of relationships, obviously, that affect how people feel about their jobs in restaurants, which is the relationship with the managers. And we know from the fact that workers are unionizing, that they're engaging in sexual harassment suits all over the place. We've got documentation from people like Barbara Ehrenreich, recently deceased, about how demeaning many of those jobs are, not necessarily in the high-end restaurant that you're talking about. So to talk about this system, I think really requires you to also address the other side of it, which is the relationship with management, and to figure out how generalizable what you were saying is.
Right. Thank you. Was that a question?
Well, how are you dealing with those questions?
Right. So again, I think this restaurant is unique in that I've been there for going on 8 years now. Other workers have been there for years, and we have the management relative to other restaurants. We have a pretty good, I'd say relatively good relationship with the managers, and they keep that in mind. It's very unique in that when workers come, they look at money, how much money they would make, and the schedule, because we work long hours, and then the flexibility. So what's important to restaurant workers, I would say, are those things, and then also the restaurant culture. The managers hire people who exude a genuine warmth and who are friendly. And we think about, I know this is a broad, maybe a low term, but the culture of the restaurant. Everyone at the restaurant is really warm and kind and to one another. And so I would say, relative to other fine dining restaurants, we have a really good relationship with the management, and so it's not employee. Although we also have similar disputes as most employees do have with managers in terms of maybe moving up and promotions and things like that. But I don't think it's a traditional work setting. My other point was that I think what's different in fine dining historically is that there has been, perhaps in the past 10, 15 years, the professionalization of the hospitality industry has shifted such that now workers want to work in hospitality. There's culinary schools. Culinary schools like the CIA used to have just a culinary program, and now they have a front of the house business 4-year program that focuses on front of the house hospitality. There are people who go into the wine industry, and the track is a sommelier. And so people come into the industry, if people want to focus and have a career in restaurants, they do tend to go to high-end restaurants, and then all the other things, but particularly money makes a big difference too. I don't know if that answered your question, but sorry. It is very unique because my case study is one and my sample is one. So.
You didn't mention tipping, so I wonder to what degree sort of that enters into the relationship. Is there any instrumentality among the staff in terms of the warmth that they show to the patrons? And then also, are tips divided with backs backroom staff, the dishwashers, and the others? And so what are the relations, is there a hierarchy among workers in that sense?
Right. So the tips at downtown are not shared among the back of the house workers. And there is so to your question about whether we are motivated to be, is it about whether our work and our intentions are motivated by the money that we make? Is that right?
Well, partially, I mean, to what degree is that a factor?
Right.
It enters into defining the
Sure. What I found in my interviews is that it's really hard to predict who is going to tip well and who isn't. There are times when you spend a lot of time with guests and you have a great interaction, and then inevitably, you look at the bill, the servers look at the bill, and they tipped, very little, 5% or so. They may be visiting from Europe and perhaps they don't understand the tipping system here. And then there are others where you have a very informal interaction. Maybe the guests were somewhat cold, and they end up leaving 30 or 40%. So what I find is that, at least in my interviews, the staff they can't be motivated by tips, mostly because it would just be, they wouldn't enjoy their work. So the workers at downtown genuinely like hospitality and service work. And it is also one of the main reasons why they are hired. It's whether you want to give people a great experience. And so I find, at least in my interviews, is that tipping is not a motivation. Not at this caliber, and mostly because the workers want to be in fine dining, or many of them want to have a future in fine dining and hospitality. So this is career driven.
You mentioned the aspect of workers meeting customers outside of the establishment, and the idea of a greater opportunity for equality in terms of being outside of the work environment. It can lead to perhaps further job opportunities, or even where a client may say, come work with me, let's start our own club. I mean, there is an opportunity for equality to manifest itself. Is that true or not?
Yeah, absolutely. Those relationships, with the scope of this paper, I didn't go beyond relationships outside of the restaurant, but there have been numerous occasions where workers have been offered positions or have gone to other places through people that they've met at the restaurant. And that's something that is not uncommon in the restaurant industry. But it is based on what kind of relationship you have with the guests. Yeah, that does matter. Thank you.